I don't want to. I'm afraid.
Don't be afraid.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
Our bodies can be beautiful, and our bodies can be strange. Our bodies can be amazing, but they also can be terrifying. They can be our best friend, but also our worst enemy. There is a whole subgenre in film that exploits this horror called, you guessed it, body horror, that reaps benefit from our mind knowing on a instinctive level where our eyes should be, where our mouth should be, our hands, our feet, our arms, our legs, our organs and skin, that when they are not where they are supposed to be, it can cause horror and trigger a shocking emotion. And that's our topic for today. Now, Eric, I almost sat down and watched The Human Centipede to prepare for our discussion today about body horror, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, which speaks to my limited tolerance to this subgenre. Let's try to classify body horror first. And this is just going to be a casual conversation between me and Eric. And this was actually Eric's great idea. We were originally going to just do a retrospective of The Fly. And he was like, why don't we just do body horror in general? So, but with anyone who's unfamiliar with the title, the phrase body horror, it's part of the gross gore horror genre. But you could divide that gore horror genre between, I guess, violent and non-violent in a way that if you have gore that comes from violence, if it comes from knives and axes or bites, and you get this bloody splatter, that is usually known as bloody horror. But gore that comes from transformation, invasion, mutation, infection, disease, that is known as body horror. What is your just general thoughts, Eric, in regards to body horror and that subgenre?
Well, it's as you said, we're going to try a new thing from here on out. It's not doing specific film reviews, but arcing over various media. So when we come to something like body horror, I was going through films and stuff I've got, because it's not just films, it's books, it's TV shows, it's comics, it's cartoons. You've got Master of the Universe behind you. Body horror, Skeletor. That's something a lot of us had from an early age. Yeah. It's any kind of transformative mutation, to some extent rebirthing, which is intended to evoke horror, I would say. So although a lot of people's minds, they will go back to the cinematic landmarks, right? Like John Carpenter's The Thing, David Cronenberg's The Fly, both of which are remakes, both of which are 80s films. Yeah. They are by no means the earliest examples of that. It kind of crept in when, as with anything, when there's enough of a demographic, like within a demographic, people start to think, well, what do we call this thing? How do we put a label on this? So someone came up with the idea of body horror. I forget who. I think it was in the 80s itself, actually. But
oh, really? Was that recent?
I think so. Somebody out there will correct me, I'm sure, if I'm wrong. But it actually, when you look back, through time, it's not something that started in the 80s by any means. What are zombie films? Zombie films, anything to do with the undead, that's body horror. That's the very epitome of body horror. But even further back than that, I was going through some films I had, and I went, does that class as body horror? Yeah, it does. And one of them was, Beowulf. That is an old English poem, and you have Grendel, Grendel's mother. And some of that is, verges on body horror.
Really?
Certainly, you've got it in Clash of the Titans because it goes back to the Greek myths, the gods and things transforming. What is Medusa? Medusa was, in some variants of the myth, she was a beautiful woman transformed for the crime of Zeus not being able to keep it in his trousers, as with a lot of tragedies in those myths. And his other half got jealous and transformed Medusa into this creature. In, I think, the original myths, the Gorgons, they were sisters, and Medusa isn't the only one, and they were monsters from the start. But go way back in history, all the myths about the Titans and half-human hybrid things. It does touch on what we would now call body horror. And yet, back in the day, our ancestors would have been entertained by these myths and legends which incorporate this. But we need to distinguish transformation of the flesh. Like David Cronenberg, his films often use like disease and aging as analogies for what he touches on. I think he was confused when The Fly came out and critics started saying, it's a thing for AIDS, because that was, it was coming more into media awareness. And he said, well, you can, if you want to put that focus on it, you can, but that wasn't his intention. It was just like for disease and stuff in general.
Well, let me stop you real quick as we
Yes.
categorize this. So I sometimes was at least on the understanding that like simple monster transformations, like universal monsters, say a werewolf, a Frankenstein aside, that's body horror, wouldn't be classified as body horror. That these monster transformations, they become werewolf at night, human by day, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Even though there is a physical body transformation, it's not, at least what I understand, to be classified under the body horror subgenre. There has to be some sort of degradation to the flesh. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, that's the thing. An American Werewolf in London, that's often put under the banner classification of a body horror film. Although, in fairness, it should be pointed out that in that film, the character, like, he keeps interacting with like these walking corpses and stuff, which themselves are body horror. But his transformation, it's one of the best werewolf transformations to this day. But it is classed as a body horror film.
Really? Okay.
But as you say, I think it's in the eye of the beholder whether you personally want to.
There might not be clear lines in the subgenre.
Yeah, because by that same token, I was thinking earlier in the day that, well, that also brings into the Native American legends of the Skinwalker. That could be body horror, but it's legends and so forth. But yeah, you can have transformative, because it's a transformative process, but it's meant to evoke horror. Not everything of this will evoke horror, like Cocoon. That's an 80s film. It's about, things going in literal cocoons, and there's a transformative thing that happens, but it's to renew them. It's a good, positive thing. That's not body horror. It involves transformation, but it's not body horror. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Angel, they played around. Sometimes they used body horror for horror. Other times they used it for comedy. Mars Attacks is unquestionably a comedy. The original card thing it was based on was pretty much, it was horror for kids. But in the film, you have Pierce Brosnan and Sarah Jessica Parker, and the aliens are doing all these experiments with humans, but they put their heads. I think Pierce Brosnan's head is just sort of levitated and severed, and her head has been put on her chihuahua.
Yeah,
that's body horror.
That is definitely body horror.
It's comedy. It's comedy.
Yeah.
So it's not meant to evoke horror. So would someone classify that as body horror?
I think, yeah, I think in Mars Attacks, it's unequivocally body horror. But I think we risk going down
using it to evoke amusement,
and that's fine.
That's its primary intention. Yeah,
right. I just think there's a danger of going down the rabbit hole if we broaden the categories so much that it almost invites the entire horror genre.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you have, like, for example, a thing most of us grew up with, at least in the modern age, Spider-Man, right? Spider-Man, Peter Parker, he has a transformation, he has abilities. He's mostly himself, though. He can shoot webbing biologically in some versions, other versions not. But he has, spider senses. He can crawl on walls, blah, blah, blah. But there is one storyline in Spider-Man where there is Man Spider, who literally transforms. He is body horror because he becomes part spider, literally. He's like a bipedal thing. That's body horror. But Peter Parker on his own, that's not body horror. A lot of Marvel heroes, they have transformation, they gain abilities, but they still look normal. They look human. So it's a transformative thing, but it's not body horror.
Right. And even if it's handled as a comedy, that's why I still see Mars Attacks as body horror. But what happens to Peter Parker? But what the transformation isn't horrific for Peter Parker, or say the transformation in the Fly, which was what, 1986, I think it was. Something like that. But when Jeff Goldblum, Seth Brindle, started feeling all that physical vitality, and he's doing the gymnastics like he's Olympic gymnast, swinging on those poles and stuff. If that was the limit to his transformation, technically, I think Peter Parker would fall in that realm that it's not a horrific transformation. It's actually an improvement. I mean,
initially, when you do the origin stories, he always has that moment of doubt: am I going to continue mutating? But as it goes on, he hits his genetic transformation hits a brick wall, and so he doesn't go any further. But there is that storyline where, in some continuities, he does, or another character does, and of course, you could say Venom might be regarded as that kind of thing as well. Venom and Carnage, and that's kind of continuity. You do have characters like the Incredible Hulk. Clearly, he transforms majorly.
Actually, with the Incredible Hulk, it was a recent run called The Immortal Hulk, where they actually took the Hulk into horror and into body horror, where these characters that typically had unique monster looks like abominations, suddenly their heads are splitting apart and they have screaming faces and they look like something out of John Carpenter's The Thing. And it's a really great
Marvel Zombies. They've done that whole thing. That is absolute full of body horror right there.
Yeah. So the best way for me to categorize it was in what I was saying before, was that transformation, the mutation, the invasion, right? Like parasitic, a parasite, or any kind of mutilation caused by disease, and
or supernatural as well. That can happen.
Yes, supernatural. But when it's by like sharp weapons, even if it's torture porn,
Hellraiser. That's an obvious one. That is all just mutilation to an extreme. A lot of body horror is in Hellraiser. Right. But I mean, also, a lot of us would have grown up in childhood. One of our first traumatic scenes would have been Raiders of the Lost Ark, You know, the thing
Oh,
opens and
yeah.
he melts. Another one.
Wait, before you go there, how is that movie? What was that rated in the UK? Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Don't
That
know. I would
that
think it
was
would at least be PG. Back
that
in the
was
day.
PG, and you see
I
people's
don't know,
faces
but
melting
yeah.
and eyeballs like popping out of their skulls, and
Yeah.
it's amazing what they got away with. It was for kids. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, in the America, we have that PG, and then we have the PG-13 and the rated R, and kids were able to watch so much more graphic body horror than they definitely would be allowed to watch
Yeah.
today. So let's talk about you and body horror. And my general question before, like, what do you think about it? And I'm going to put it in this context. I mean, for me, just as a film fan, right? And by the way, I do think before I even get to how does Eric feel about body horror, I do think this is one of those cases, this subgenre, where it is more appropriate, beneficial. I can't find the right word, but more suited for visual medium for film than other genres. Like, I think body horror is better on film than it could ever be in a book. I don't know.
I think it will be on a case by case basis. I mean, the obvious example is not just Frankenstein, but it's also The Mummy. The Mummy is body horror. It will depend on what the author is going for. I mean, you could probably evoke, say you did, I assume The Fly and The Thing had novel adaptations. You could probably evoke what Seth Brundle was going through mentally and how it felt to him in ways you can't do on a film. But in a visual medium, you will see things. So yeah, body horror. Certain things you could write about, you won't necessarily make people feel squeamish. The best body horror is when it makes you feel squeamish. Now, you were talking about Human Centipede. Have you ever watched it before?
No, I mean, I've seen parts, I've seen on YouTube, but I've never been able to stomach and sit through this entire thing. And this goes back to what I was going to ask of you, Eric, because see, for me, body horror generally is already on the wrong foot with me because my preference in horror is not gore. Yeah, I prefer psychological horror, grossing an audience out was always perceived as cheap to me, with exceptions. But I always felt like showing less was more. Like, have you ever seen? I think it's a very underappreciated film. It starred Ethan Hawke and was called Sinister. And did you ever see that film?
I've not. No, I've not. What it rings a bell. I've heard of it, but I've not watched it myself.
So it's Ethan Hawke, and he goes upstairs to his attic, and he finds these old 8mm reels, and they're all snuff films of murders that have been done in the 70s. And there's this. He starts watching them, and he really starts a descent into madness. But none of the snuff films actually show gore, but the gore is assumed. And one of these films is this man or woman, whoever's doing the killing, likes to film everything he's killing. And there's this one scene where he's just mowing the lawn. It's like, okay, this is weird. This is not killing somebody. And he's mowing the lawn, and he has the camera on the lawnmower, and suddenly there's someone tied up on the grass, and the lawnmower is about to run over her. And then you see Ethan Hawke scream, fall off his chair because he's watching the screening of this. And the music jumps in, and holy cow, and my heart skipped a beat, and I never saw a drop of blood. And I've always seen that, or felt that filming this way was so much more powerful because it was left to your imagination. And body horror and gore in general does not leave things to your imagination, does it?
It can do. I mean, this shirt I'm wearing, it's to do with Alien. Now, Alien it has this famous deleted scene where Dallas and Brett are being transformed into eggs. That would have put it squarely in body horror territory. And yet the scenes that everyone has seen, everybody goes mad about, the chest burster scene. But to me, that's not the most powerful, disturbing scene in the whole film. The most powerful and disturbing scene is Lambert's death. We never see anything. Well, you see the prelude to it, and then all you do is hear Lambert, Veronica Cartwright, and you hear what contributes to it is these noises she's making that sound very much like someone giving birth, a woman giving birth. And Ripley gets to them, and you kind of see something like a hand or a leg or something, and there's I think a couple of drips of blood, but you don't see it. It's Ripley's expression when she finds them. She is, she has this sort of, and it's all her reaction, and that's the most unsettling part in the whole of Alien to me. It's Lambert's demise. It's not the chest burster. It's that because your mind just goes on overdrive. Now, you're to me,
you're in agreement with me then, in a way, that sometimes less is more.
That goes for like things in general, but there are times when you say, "What is it to me?" To me, it's another tool. It's another tool in the toolbox. You can be gratuitous about it, or you can use it wisely. And there's nothing wrong with being full-on body horror, so long as it's appropriate. It's like, doing an artillery strike. You can bombard the whole area and destroy city blocks worth of buildings, and you don't hit the target. Someone else can have like a GPS guided munition, and it won't destroy the whole area, but it will get the target. And the one that's the mission accomplished is the one who gets the target. And it's not nearly as massive, as devastating, but that's the one that's a mission accomplished. The same goes for a film, a comic, a book, as long as you hit the target. Now, how do you hit the target? It's whatever feels right for that scene. So, yeah, body horror. Now, I said earlier, I was about to say RoboCop. Now, it's not what happens to Murphy. There's that scene where the guy has been, covered in the toxic chemicals and he's mutated, and he's like, that's body horror, and it's in RoboCop. The Terminator, I would argue, that has some degree of body horror because it has the iron arm surgery sequence, even though the Terminator is not a human being. It doesn't feel pain. It is just being completely sick. It is doing self-repair. But to the viewer, it verges, especially with the eye, it does get into that squeamish feel. But it's filmed very much appropriately. But that's why the Terminator, the original one, has those moments of horror. It is not just an action film. So for me, body horror is a tool. It's like with anything, like lighting, sound, good set design. Everything has its place. And it's like a meal, right? If you're making a meal and you just add all the sugar and everything, you'll taste it. This is too much. But if you have things in the right ingredients, the right appropriate amounts, you can make a masterpiece, like a cocktail or a beautiful meal.
And I agree with you, body horror as an ingredient. And I agree with you in regards to Terminator and to RoboCop, but we're talking about the actual genre. We're talking movies like The Human Centipede.
Yeah.
Did you
That's
watch?
what I was going to mention. I've watched The Human Centipede because I was very intrigued as to how they went about it. And I will say, I was prepared for wall-to-wall muck, all over, gore, hot. It's actually got way less than I was expecting. It's actually one of the few films where when I watched it, I had to actually turn off part of the way through, but not because of anything, graphic. The part that made me turn off was, without spoiling the story, there's a part where this doctor character is chasing a girl around his house, and hunting her down. And
Okay.
so for the life of me, I don't know why,
Hmm.
but something about the way that was playing out, it just made me feel nauseous. I don't know. It might have been because I knew, well, he's got to catch her, and I know what her fate is, something like that. But the strength of Human Centipede is not, the obvious thing catches the headlines. He's actually passed on now, but Dieter Laser, he does one of the most effective, chilling portrayals of a villain I have seen in horror. He's right up there with Anthony Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter.
Really?
Honestly, his portrayal of the Dr. Heiter, I think it is, Dieter Laser, he's just got this like he chews the scenery like no one's business, but it's a really good villainous portrayal. And a lot of it is not about like the ass to mouth thing. That happens, but their heads are covered with bandages, so you don't see things. Not much actually happened. Like the most disturbing things is about like, what he does to their kneecaps because he wants to incapacitate them. And that's quite odd because what's happened, but it's not there. But Human Centipede is actually, you wouldn't think it, but it's a weirdly effective example of actually less is more. And you would never
Really?
think that. But actually, you do not see much in the way of gore in it. Most of it is about the consequences and the hunt and Dieter Laser's masterful performance. It's very much, it's weirdly psychological, that film. You would never think it, but that's my memories of it, at least. So I'm interested to see what you will make of it. But yes, body horror genre, absolutely, it belongs in there, but it is not wall to wall. The sequel is most definitely gore to gore, wall to wall. That is very much cheap and tacky. The first one, the first Human Centipede, is very much an effective psychological horror in many ways. It is a very chilling film.
You talking about the sequels, that reminds me of just my general feelings about gore to begin with versus psychological horror. There's a reason why there's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the 70s film, on my shelf, but no other sequel. Because that movie was actually surprisingly, you see something that says the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you think there's going to be chainsaws ripping people apart and gore and body parts, but it's surprisingly hardly at all gory.
Yeah.
And same thing, I would argue, the first Saw movie that had Danny Glover from Predator 2, one of my favorite
Which is
movies.
quite a cleverly constructed storyline in that film. It's a compelling film.
And even when one of the, spoiler alert, when one of the heroes, I guess you could say, is cutting off his own leg, you never actually see him cut his own leg. The camera stays on his face as he has something, in his mouth that he can bite down, and he's cutting, and the guy that's chained up with him is screaming, but you never see an ounce of gore.
And you see how that their performances sold that scene. It wasn't about the prosthetics and fake blood. It was about an actor's performance. And it's strange to say that when you're talking about body horror and horror films in general, because people think of them as, oh, they're cheap and tacky. It's all about blood. But it's not. The best ones sell it with performance and direction, obviously, but it's like you said, right, that is like Lambert's death in Alien. It's Veronica Cartwright. I mean, it turns out she didn't realize they were going to edit it that way. How it was filmed was she actually has a heart attack before the alien can touch her. So what you're actually seeing is her performing it like that. But these kind of films, although they are classified as body horror, you do see things. But some of the best things, some of the things that stay with you the most, they stay with you the most for the right reasons, because a lot of it is to do with what it evokes in you.
So I prefer the less gore, and I know that's a tricky way to navigate with this subgenre. And you know what also makes me feel uncomfortable, Eric, in regards to body horror? is when it taps into primal fears of sickness, disease, and cancer. Because, and I think it's because, I lost both my father and mother too early. And one was from kidney disease, and the other, my mom, cancer. And she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and that spread into her lymph nodes. And my mother, she was like, very health conscious. She was like a yoga instructor and a nutritionist and a vegetarian. And she was convinced that she could beat the illness, and she was convinced that she could do it, beat it. Uh, what is that? Homeopathically, I guess.
Homeopathic, yeah.
Yeah, and but it was almost, man, it was almost a year to the day of when she was diagnosed. That I was with her when she was like got a body scan at the doctor's, and her body, well, the doctor said it was riddled with tumors the size of golf balls, and she maybe had a few weeks to live, and then she was going to die. And maybe that perhaps is the reason why this subgenre makes me feel so uncomfortable sometimes, depending when it's that approach, because some of them do tap into that fear, that primal fear of us standing in front of a mirror one day and seeing something that wasn't there before, perhaps a lesion or a lump, or a strange growth, and you hope it'll go away, but sometimes it doesn't, and it grows, and it's like an enemy spreading into your own body. And so some of these tap into real horror for me that makes it uncomfortable, where I'm sometimes just looking for escapism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have like you have a film like Virus. That is very much I mean, that's cybernetic body horror. You literally see body parts all over the place, but it is.
Was that was Jamie Lee Curtis?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know that
and
one.
Donald Sutherland, who does a weird performance in that. But that's, I would argue that, I mean, that is a bit exploitative because of the sheer amount of gore in it, but it's relevant to the storyline. And it's one of my favorite, machine horror sort of films, Virus. Whereas you get something like Species, that's an H.R. Giger. He I would argue Syl in Species is more biomechanical than the Alien was. That is something which uses body horror transformation. It's not about what the character, the villain, if you will, in a way, although she's driven by her nature. It's not what she does to her victims. It's Syl is undergoing her own transformations, because she's literally she is a hybrid. And some of the most effective stuff in that is when there's Forrest Whitaker. He plays this empath psychic character, and they replay some of the video of when Syl's a teenage girl before she went into a cocoon, and you have this. And it's a really spooky. It's a very disturbing scene. It only lasts for a few seconds, but there's this kind of, not a pig squeal, but there's this kind of thing where her whole body convulses like that, and it's all about Forrest Whitaker's character, how he empathically reacts to how she is, what's going on because he talks about it's going on inside her, and it's giving her those terrible nightmares. And you start to realize that for Syl, it's not just a physical transformation, it's mental transformation as well.
Yeah.
But with that film, it's very much about body horror transformation, it's making her stronger. In The Fly, there reaches a point where Seth Brundle, he goes from someone, like as you say, he's basically having cancer.
Yeah.
He's going through and he's becoming weaker and he can't fit, and then it turns on his head, and that's when he starts to embrace it, and he embraces it to such a degree that he gets abusive in the relationship with Gina Davis' character, and he gets in a temper tantrum because she will not go through the teleportation. She doesn't want, because she doesn't know what's happened. She doesn't want to go into it with him, but then he starts to embrace it. He realizes she was right. He is becoming this hideous thing, but then he realized, no, I can climb walls. I feel stronger. I'm doing this. This was good. I don't know. And he goes through this weird conundrum of he wants to reverse it, but then he realizes, should I reverse it? And yet The Fly is very much about, like, he has that scene where he opens the refrigerator and he's got these internal organs that he's coughed up and stuff, and they're all in glass jars, and he's just adding to it like a collection.
Yeah, see, that one, The Fly, is tapping into real horror for me, and real,
because it's
like,
his body
disease and
rebelling
cancer.
against itself.
Right. In the beginning, yes, he feels more energetic, but his body starts falling apart. His ears fall off. He's biting on his pencil, and his teeth come out.
Teeth come out, yeah.
The hair pull out, and he's degrading in front of what is that actress? Gina Davis's eyes. That is where, like you were mentioning about Species and stuff like that, or, more fantastical films like The Thing. That one doesn't sometimes bother me as much as movies that are like The Fly, that, we depict a main character that is losing himself. Before everyone's eyes. He's losing his identity. He's losing his consciousness. He's losing his humanity. And you see the body degrade into something else, either it's a fly or it's a zombie short term or something like that. And those often emulate terminal diseases. And those I have a rougher time versus, a creature from outer space with The Thing, and Species, and
because The Thing is not, it's not someone who themselves is changing. The Thing is something that's it's an imposter. It's putting on the disguise. It's copying you to emulate you, to worm its way into. It's like the parasite. Society would be its host, whereas something like Brundlefly, it's him transforming. His flesh is rebelling against himself, like cancer.
Well, I think that horror tends to be a often used trope, right? The degrading of the, and it is horrific to us, right? Because we all have nightmares about, we all fear, or most of us fear, our mortality. And
but what was the tagline of The Thing? It was "Man is the warmest place to hide," I think.
Oh yeah.
That's the epitome of that kind of.
But that was pure escapism, and I think that might have been my first experience with body horror, was John Carpenter's The Thing. And but I think what really horrified me as a child was, out of that entire movie, The Thing, it was when one of the things, or the thing, was trying to duplicate Bennings, and he didn't have enough time. And that's the character that runs out into the cold and everyone surrounds him, and Bennings is holding that hand that is still like deformed and not a human hand.
He does that really inhuman scream.
It still gets me to this day, but I might have turned off the video as a kid.
Well, there's a similar thing, again, another Donald Sutherland character, and again another remake of oh god, what's it called? Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And that scene where they all sort of, like, Donald Sutherland's characters does that, points the finger and go, which, by itself, if that happened to you, you'd be going like, what? But
Mhm.
in how it's depicted, it's quite unsettling. It's quite disturbing how they've done
Yeah.
it on the film.
It's that instinctive level we have embedded in our mind that something should look a certain way. It's like, well, you
Yeah.
know, it's us
It's not right.
right.
Something's wrong, and in many of these things, it's wrong at a genetic level,
Mhm.
or it's like here's one where it's very gory, and yet it's very much appropriate. Now, I don't even know if you've watched it. Event Horizon.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, some of the most disturbing are those little logs from the original ship's crew. That is
Oh, yeah.
complete body horror, completely within this genre, and yet there's another layer on top of it as things go on that you start to realize these are cosmic forces involved.
I'm one of the ones that ties that movie to Hellraiser and say,
Yeah,
"Hey,
it's
it's
very
in the
much
same universe," you know? Because you
it's
have the lament configuration, and then you have
yes,
the
yeah, the
gravity,
reactor,
and
yeah,
then you have the gravity drive that sort of moves in this strange configuration, and,
yeah,
even Pinhead, he's like, you know, he has that famous, you know, "We have such sights to show
yeah.
you," and then,
And Sam Neill is just going crazy in that film.
yeah, well, he says something to the fact that I have wonderful things to show you as well. I mean, it's very
Well,
close.
yeah, I think what I remember him saying is we don't need eyes where we're going. We don't need eyes, or we don't need eyes to see, something like that. It's like the inverse of that.
But I
Although
think
it
he was
always makes me think of Doc Brown in the end of Back to the Future.
well, if you
We
look
don't
at
need
him
roads.
with his eyes gouged
Uh,
out and stuff, that, Weir looks almost like a Cenobite, that he's becoming a
yes,
Cenobite.
yeah, a lot of, especially it's when he's bald, because it's got that kind of scarring,
Mhm.
ritualistic scarring. But it's those ship logs. What happened to the previous crew? And
Yeah.
that is wall to wall, but it's done appropriately. And because they are ship logs that the characters see, you get like snippets of them. And then
Mhm.
you see their reactions to what they're seeing. And what's most disturbing about it is that Latin they speak, which it turns out that's not an accurate translation. But you have this detective story of later on, he says, "Oh, it doesn't mean that. It actually means something else," and it brings those scenes back to mind. But because you've seen that, it's appropriate because you know that's what Weir has. That's what he's got planned for them. So what it's done, it's helped to raise the stakes because you've seen that. You know, later on, you don't want to go to that other dimension because you know that's what's waiting for them, and it's far worse than just slitting someone with a knife across their throat. This is unending torment, and in fact, one of the best scenes in that isn't body horror. It's the kid who just gets possessed. He goes through
Yeah.
the gateway momentarily. He comes out, and then he wakes up and he goes to the airlock and he seals himself. And he said, "You wouldn't want to live if you've seen what I've seen." And then he starts the countdown, and then he comes to. He said, "Where am I?" And it steadily dawns upon you that something was possessing him because it wanted to feed on his fear.
Yeah.
That hasn't got any body horror in it, and yet that is the disturbing thing about that. But Event Horizon, very much.
I still get that sense of that pleasure and pain, especially from Weir, Dr. Weir. If you do look through those flashes, there is an interesting sex scene as well that I don't want to
Yes.
describe it.
Yeah.
But, yeah, so I don't know, but that's me personally and puts it together. But, have you ever seen I did see I guess it's Human Centipede like. It was a Kevin Smith film called Tusk.
I've not seen it, but in the course of research for this, I've come across scenes of it and stuff. Yes.
Yeah, this one was another
It's
interesting
got
thing.
that you either hate it or you love it, Peel, from what I understand.
I did watch it, and it's not terribly gory, but I think it's just mad scientist, I guess, kind of like you're
Yeah.
describing in Human Centipede. And it was a great actor. Actually, who stole the show, though, was this detective that I recognize while I'm watching this. He's trying to find out, there's this mad scientist out there that apparently when he was a younger child, he was saved by a walrus.
Walrus, yeah.
And it was from a shipwreck, and it was him and this walrus on this island, and this walrus actually brought him to land and saved him. But after going without so much food for so many days, he was forced to kill the walrus that saved him. And he ate
the tusk, isn't it?
and he ate the walrus. And then later in life is decreed that humans are the true monsters, and the walrus was the only thing pure in his life. So he wants to modify people into walruses, and he has a lot of failed experiments. So he's deemed as a serial killer because there's people missing, and he's doing these body transformations. But actually, who stole the show is this homicide detective that I kept like, who's this guy? I recognize him. It took me a while. It's Johnny Depp, but with all these facial appliances, like a larger nose, like something you'd see out of Gandalf or something like that. Right. But again, it was very weird, and he would actually
a suit made of skin, doesn't it? That
he starts with cutting off the captive's legs and then uses the leg bones as tusks. And then actually like sews his arms together to his body, so he has no, arms, and then tries to make him swim and eat raw fish, and literally tried to convince him through just through, I guess, years of torture, if he's able, that you are a walrus, you are no longer human. And the main character that we follow starts, I think, believing he's a walrus. If you go through this torture long enough, you become, what is that called? I think it's some sort of syndrome, but it's another, and I was watching it and I was still trying to figure out where was the artistic merit, like this in Human Centipede. It's got to start with, wouldn't it be cool or wouldn't it be horrific if we sewed people together and made them poop in their mouth and become a human centipede, and then they build a story around it. And same thing.
I mean, I think the Human Centipede, it started out with the director. He said that that's what you should do with like child molesters and things, and then he thought, actually, you can make a story out of that. I think Tusk was Kevin Smith on a podcast or something. They came up with this story and they said, let's make a film out of it. I mean, it's when we're talking about body, there's another. It's not always it's obvious horror. There are different ways of using it because it is all about a transformative experience. When we talk about Species is mainly about sex and pregnancy. Another body horror one, Splice, that has a lot of not a lot, but there is definitely a couple of scenes in it which focus very much on about sex and reproduction in that.
Some people derive sexual pleasure from body horror, and legitimate body horror.
Hentai, Japanese cartoons, so much to do with body horror. Very much to do with, even like normal Japanese anime. There's so much body horror which features in that, and it's in an animated form. But there's definitely a lot of in hentai. There's a lot of like, because a lot of that also goes down to like Japanese legends of like demons and stuff, and but it always comes down to tentacles and Japanese schoolgirls. But I mean, it's we're talking about like primal things, right?
But even self-mutilation. I mean, I remember listening to, it was in popular radio show hosts, Howard Stern here in the US about 30 years ago, longer than that. And he would have some strange people on, and there was this one woman that like was missing some toes and stuff. And she, that was done to her either by herself or by someone else, and derived like almost a orgasmic pleasure out of it. There's some sort of
some people have that kind of fetish.
Yeah, I wish I knew what that was called. So I wonder if this subgenre.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it also is. I would expect body horror, not so much the horror component, but things to do. They touch on these themes. It might have more relevance in today's age because you hear about like body dysmorphia and also like the transgender issue, because that's to do with transformative processes. Another, what you talking about, like sex and all that. Now, we talked in a private message and we were going through like what films we could review, and I mentioned Return of the Living Dead 3, and you said you've never watched it.
Correct.
When you do get to watch it, it's one of the few zombie love stories. It's very weird. It's one of Melinda Clarke's earliest roles. She went by the name of Mindy Clarke back then. But it's, even though it is clearly a very cheap, low-budget film, it's remained one of my favorite zombie films. She does an amazing performance in it. What happens is, it follows on from the events of like the second film, where the US Army have sealed all these zombies in these containers, and there's a colonel or something. His son goes and takes this. She's a bit of a bad girl, and he takes her, and they want to. I forget why, but they want to go off and do something, like they're rebellious kids. And he knows his father has got this secret lab, so they go up there and they look through the glass and they see this. They're seeing the US Army. They're trying to mentally condition zombies to act as super soldiers. But various events conflate where the girl gets infected by one, and he gets her out of there. Her boyfriend gets her out of there, and from that moment on, you as the audience know what's happening. She's been infected, but it's very slow, and she starts to change. She's got this weird, she's got hunger, but she tries to eat normal food and it just makes her sick. And then the inevitable happens. It goes on and on. But what keeps her sane is pain. And it gets to a stage where this infection has overcome her so much that she has to mutilate herself, because it's like just scratching herself or pinching herself isn't enough. It's got to such an extreme where she needs that just to keep level head. And if she doesn't do it, she's afraid that she will kill him. And so it's got this thing where she is the only way, and you really feel for her. You do, because she is doing her damnedest to keep human, and she looks like she's undergoing a fever and all the rest of that. He is, poor guy, he's in love with her. He's trying to do good by her. He can't, obvious. And it has a bittersweet ending, and she doesn't give in to the monster in the end, but there is it's an undead Romeo and Juliet tale, and she manages to just about keep her struggle with sanity. But you do have this very exploitative scene in it where the director has basically just wanted a hot girl to go topless and have all. But it's an iconic image because she's got like metal nails driven through her palm, and she's mutilated herself, but it's very fetishist, like Hellraiser. She looks like a Cenobite. Her boyfriend's just like a normal teenager. He can't do anything, and they want her because she's a hot girl. So they think they're all this, and then she sort of rises out of this mist, and she looks like hell on earth, but sexy hell on earth. And she acts as the protector for the boyfriend, but she's a monster protector.
See,
and it's a really weird, gone inverse thing as how you'd expect it to go. But it's using transformation, body horror, as partly sexual,
Yeah,
tease for the audience, but it is using it in a way where you wouldn't expect a zombie film to go. It's
look,
a genuinely interesting film.
when you were describing this movie, okay, except
Hmm.
for boyfriend girlfriend, I was going father daughter. It was sounding a lot like Maggie. The way you were first describing this, except it's Maggie, but it's a relationship, and what it sounds like, it's also the hit like a bunch of fetishes.
It's clearly a cheap 80s zombie film.
Yeah. But when I was mentioning just Maggie right then, that's probably a good example of when it's tapping when body horror is tapping into real horror and everyday life horror. In regards to losing a loved one, seeing someone degrade before your very eyes, knowing there's no way to save that person, knowing it's not knowing it's terminal. And for anyone listening and doesn't know, it's an Arnold Schwarzenegger film, deals with a daughter, Abigail Breslin, I think is the actress, that she's bit by a zombie and he knows he's going to lose her within a matter of weeks. And I guess it's really just emulating, someone going through something like cancer or something like that. In which case, that kind of stuff for me is a harder watch. It's harder when I'm always looking for escapism. This one is almost like, well, it definitely feels like a gut punch after you watch it. And,
well, it helps. I mean, it helps that it's got a budget, but I mean, it helps that again, it's a film where the performances really sell it. And I think we've talked before, we both agreed it's really surprising for being possibly Arnold Schwarzenegger's best ever dramatic role. He plays that role beautifully. And it's a lot of that makes you feel for his predicament. And it's I mean, you could have made it about a terminal disease. They could have done that, but whatever reason, it's a zombie film, and he sells it really well. And a lot of it is, you do have that similar thing to Return of the Living Dead 3, where the girl, she is slowly becoming, and it's one of those things, do you give into it or not?
So back to the genre itself, as maybe we come full circle. I mean, what do you just generally feel about this genre? I mean, you have a Blu-ray shelf, I imagine, a DVD shelf, and is it really a essential part of your library? I mean, or do you see it as an outlier that sometimes permeates your collection? That's the way I see it. Like, I have a few that permeates my collection.
I mean, it's like vampire films. Like, some of my favorite films happen to do with vampires. I am actually quite into the vampire as a subject, but I mean, it's not a thing that defines like all my films are that.
I like it as a tool, but the actual
storytelling tool.
The actual subgenre itself seems to be filled with films that I tend to stay away from. And it's a lot of that Cronenberg films, even though I love The Fly, right? That like Reanimator and stuff like that. And a bunch of his films, that a lot of it, Human Centipede always seems to be on those lists. And it's as I think a subgenre, I can't say that there's enough there that I'm a fan of. I agree with you. I love it as a tool, but I can't say that when I look at these top 10, top 15 lists of the best body horror movies, that as this genre, that I have maybe 2, 3 of those.
I mean, you'll have films you might not have realized have body horror elements in them. Like, most people who watch this, and I bet you have watched The Matrix.
Well, and before you go there, I agree with the salt and peppering, but I just want to drill down that. What do you think about the subgenre itself in regards to, would you say you're sort of outside of it like I am? That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree. You're going to bring up The Matrix, and they're going to have some of that in The Matrix, and I love that as a tool. But I can say, as a fan of the subgenre itself, I'm not really a fan. I look at the top films that are celebrated by the body horror fans, and those mostly I'm just not interested in. So that's what I just wanted to drill down with you. That if do you think you're outside of it with me? You love it as a tool. I get that. But do you think you're
Yeah.
outside of being a fan of that subgenre? Or do you feel you're on the inside enough that, yeah, I'm a body horror fan?
I guess I straddle like
Okay.
one foot's in there, the other. Like it's not but is that a body horror film? Therefore, I want to see it. I'm more like, is that a film that deals with these subjects? Oh, it's a body horror film. Okay, I know what I'm in store for. I don't mind it. Whereas you've got a bit of an aversion. If there was one where you knew it was classified as a body horror film, you might go, maybe not. I'll put it off for another night. Whereas me, I wouldn't care. I mean, I might actually go into it, and if it's not got it, if it's like it's a body horror film and they've been like it's marketed as that, right?
Mhm.
But it it might not go far enough. I might feel a bit underwhelmed. I might go, oh, really? You could have done this, that, the other. I might feel a bit underwhelmed, whereas you might feel relieved. It's about how it's marketed, but I would say for me, I'm more of what you call like a Lovecraftian fan, which by definition is going to include body horror elements,
Yeah.
like cosmic horror. What happens if you go a little too far into the abyss? It will change you. Now, it doesn't have to change you physically, but 9 times out of 10, if it's a horror film, it's going to do that, or it's going to cause you to change others physically. And I suppose a big part of that is I am a big creature feature fan. I like monster movies.
Me
They
too.
will generally have some form of body horror, like
Yes.
Alien, right? It's got, to some degree, I would say maybe you could say Predator. Some elements of that might. It's not really got transformative.
No,
It's
yeah.
got gore in it, and the ritualistic thing of the trophy take. I'm not sure if you would call it body horror, but
Yeah, I
some
think that's
people
more of
might.
the bloody horror,
Yeah,
the ones that are used with weapons,
yeah.
knives, violence and stuff.
Whereas,
Yeah.
like I said, the Terminator, it's doing surgery. I would say it's
Yeah.
got close-ups. You are transforming the flesh, maybe, but it's not really. So I don't know if I would say, yeah, let's dump Terminator into it. But is it? Maybe not everyone would agree. But I do like the Reanimator. I haven't seen that in ages, but that is definitely a body horror. That's a
Yeah.
Lovecraft story, actually. But there is something intriguing about if you say body horror, because if you say body horror to me, I will go, oh, you mean like The Thing, like The Fly, like, I don't know, Frankenstein. That's a body horror. But somebody else might be thinking in terms of other things. I mean, like I said at the start of this, technically, I would say Skeletor is body horror. That's in He-Man. That's a
Yeah.
cartoon for kids. But I would say technically that's body horror. You have a lot of mutants in Masters of the Universe. Some of them, would you call them that? You might have Trapjaw. He's very body horror.
Yeah.
It's for me, it's like there are elements which tend to have body horror in them a lot. Whereas I don't go to see something just because it's body horror, but I would go to see something that will tend to have body horror in it. Like if people say it's a zombie game, it's a zombie horror film, I'd go, like I'm not that interested because there are that zombie films and TV shows saturated with. Whereas, really good example, something that's current, very popular. A lot of people might not realize there's a lot of body horror in it. Stranger Things. I think that is a really well-written TV show. I know some people say some series are worse than that. I've loved the whole thing, especially in the most recent episodes with the main villain. I won't spoil it, but he is absolute body horror. It's very Hellraiser-ish. They've used a lot of those kind of visuals. Very body horror. Stranger Things, I like it because it's well written and it goes into a lot of subjects that John Keel wrote
Yeah.
back in the day that was about actual paranormal stuff like Mothman and stuff like that.
I don't
That's
think it
got
ever
body
gets
horror.
classified as body horror if it's not really the main ingredient, you know?
No.
So
But this is what would you? I don't think you're yet at the stage where you will get like Amazon or Disney doing like one of those category strips that says body horror.
yeah.
They'll do horror, they'll do thriller, they might do creature feature, they might do vampires. You will not tend to, unless it's like I don't know, I've not subscribed, but something like Shudder might do it, that is a specialist horror outlet, streaming service. But you tend not to see like body horror films, even though, as we've discussed, there's a lot of body horror. But
Well,
they
I
might
really
do zombie films.
and zombie films is, it's part of that transformation, invasion, mutation, infection, disease, mutilation. I think those are the I know it wasn't 10, but the 10 commandments of
the biblical film
of being qualified as body horror. I mean, you could,
right?
like I said, you could have the goriest movie ever, but like I said, if it's done with knives, it's not body horror, it's bloody horror. So I think these are the markers you need, I think. And
we have some films get nicknamed torture porn.
yeah,
Like the Saw films have got nicknamed torture
yeah,
porn.
that's a subgenre, right?
Human Centipede, because I think that comes with people assuming they're tacky. And I think that comes more in terms of, as things go on, they make more and more sequels, it gets diluted. You will tend to get that with most series.
Yeah, so I think, if we were to put a bow on this, I do think we both are.
I'll say, if something's marketed body horror, I will give it the time of day. You might not give it the time of day. That might be a good way to say in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, I love The Fly. I love The Thing. I love The Hellraiser, even though I think that sort of skirts it, that whole pain and pleasure, and it's more pleasure mutilation versus,
well, I love it's pain. They just outright do not want Frank to have a good time.
But yeah,
the Senate. It's what do as versus what they do to their victims.
I think it's a very effective ingredient to make a masterful horror film and to generate fear in someone. Like I said, we have that primal fear of something going on in our body, something we're not aware of at first, and only presents itself to something horrible that we succumb to. And that could be an effective component in telling a scary story. But when they add the gore elements and it becomes your central focus, when it becomes your selling point, if it's sewing faces to anuses, or if it's sewing legs to a face to make tusks, yeah, I think it starts to lose its appeal for me when it's the primary selling tool. It's what's supposed to lure when that gore, that body modification, transfiguration is what's supposed to lure people to the seats. Like, oh my God, did you hear this is what they do to people? This mad scientist. Yeah, probably.
Yeah, I mean, like there's a film, American Mary. It's got Catherine Isabel, I think her name is. Here's another one that might be body horror. She's in Ginger Snaps, which is a werewolf film. There's a lot in there about transformation and stuff. But she's in American Mary as a medical student, and she learns there is this subculture of people who want body modification as a fetishist thing.
Yeah.
And in there, it's not done I mean, there's definitely horror in it, but it's not done like, she doesn't have victims. She has people who pay her for the services, but then the film uses her skill set to get justifiable revenge on someone. That's when it trips into body horror, I guess. Here's a film you might, because there's this thing about what happens when Lee trips into a genre without maybe intending to. Gremlins. Body horror? Probably not. But what happens about that scene where in the school and it's like the class has gone, class is over. The thing has gone into that cocoon and the teacher realizes it's escaped. And what you're seeing on the screen, you're still seeing this projection of this like a medical documentary, and you're seeing close-ups of like, I don't know what it is, but they're medical procedures being done on screen. And I think that's done to evoke this feeling that something is running around that's basically like a giant spider and it's got sharp teeth. But you're seeing on screen this sort of medical anatomy stuff going on, but it's done on a projection on a wall. But you as the audience, it's done for the audience, but it just happens to be in the background. Does that trip that scene over to body horror? Some people would say yes, some people no. But it's interesting that sometimes you see films that they straddle that thing, and it even can happen with body horror.
Well, it's sprinkled in some respects, and I don't mind
that.
that.
Transformative. I mean, does it have to be a human body? Because if not, then Gremlins definitely is body horror. They have the transformative quality in Gremlins, and that is a horror comedy.
Yeah. Well, I don't think, at least when it comes to the subgenre itself, it would never be classified as that. If there, if there was
outlier,
ever, yeah. I don't think Gremlins is going to ever be in body horror. If they're going to bring back Blockbuster Home Video and they put a body horror subgenre, I don't think we're ever going to see.
I mean, the sequel dealt with literal genetic transformation into a giant spider.
Eric, you put Gremlins there. You put Mars Attacks.
I was going to say Mars Attacks.
You put Terminator, and then you'd be working at that Blockbuster. You see, this is body horror because you'd be schooling everyone. It'd be the biggest section in the Blockbuster video.
Yeah, I mean, would we call like 300? Now, 300 has got actual like body modification. It's got people with suited, like they're not chainsaws, but they're massive blades with amputated limbs.
Yeah, but that might have been willing.
They've been mutilated.
That might have been willing mutilation.
Yeah, well, sometimes. But yeah, definitely like there's that executioner scene. You have the immortals, they take their masks off and they've been hideously transformed. And you have to say some of that can't have been voluntary. But you think 300 as more of an action film it's a gory action film. You wouldn't call it body horror.
I don't think when I look at the immortals
elements.
When I look at the immortal faces, I never go, I never sit and say, well, how did they become, look that way? They did have claws and stuff like that. So I never.
It's done for the purposes of revulsion in the audience. That's the other thing. So it is, if it's for the purpose of, if it's
they're monsters
transforming flesh to evoke horror. So could it, mate? It's one of those that could straddle the line.
Well, yeah, it could straddle the line. Again, at least the way I would divide it is if there was a willing participant. It's just almost where I almost separate.
But then you get
Hellraiser.
Species.
I almost separate Hellraiser from this subgenre because it's not just pain; it's pleasure, right? And there's that lack of a fine line, that gray area of what's pleasure, what's pain, what's heaven, what's hell, or these demons or these angels, that I'm able to separate that from this genre in some respect.
And yeah, as I said, we've got Species. Syl, once she's come out of the cocoon, she no longer fears it. She sees her transformative abilities as something she wants to embrace. In fact, there's this very interesting thing that the main characters don't ever find out, and it's to do with she abducts a woman and she comes to this philosophical realization of she needs to strike them or they will strike her, sort of
Yeah.
thing. And she doesn't fear, it doesn't harm her, it doesn't cause her pain. She can transform at will. It is very much a horror film. And you have the body transformative stuff, and she
Yeah.
literally, she puts her tongue goes through someone's skull at one point. I would say that's a body horror film, but the actual transformative mutation stuff, it's done on a willing party. I mean, she didn't volunteer for it, but it's a willing person. She embraces it in the same way as Seth Brundle embraces it. The only point he
He doesn't.
regrets it is when he gets merged with the metal.
No.
In half.
I will disagree with you there. He embraces it until his body starts falling apart. And then he tells Veronica to stay away. But the only reason he goes chasing after Veronica is when he finds out that she's pregnant and she's going to kill the baby.
Because he sees that as the last vestige. But then he has this mad scientist idea. If he only cared at that point about he sees he still see, because he does see the baby as the last remnants of his humanity, because he begs her to keep it. But when he abducts her and tells her to go through, it's for the purpose of teleporting them in a fusion of one. He calls it, we're going to be the ultimate family.
Yes.
He is going to forcefully teleport them into one being. That is no longer at that point someone who cares about his humanity. He has fully embraced his otherness.
I agree.
He wants to force her and the unborn child into it against their will.
I agree, but what I'm saying is that's still a fix. He still sees what's happening to him, his transformation, as a problem, as an illness, as it's a remedy. It's a sick remedy, obviously, to merge all three of them into one body. But I don't think he ever accepts the transformation. It's always, but he accepts.
He accepts his fate. Beyond everything is chasing the dragon with him.
Well, he accepts his fate until he learns about the baby. And then I think he comes up with that remedy. But
it's not. It's clearly not going to make them. It's going to make the unborn child and Veronica as much of whatever he's become as he is.
Well,
that is at that point he has gone. This is the next stage in evolution. You must join. He's become the Borg. Basically. Actually, that is a really good one I've just thought of. That is a family-friendly TV show, Star Trek. The Borg absolutely nailed body horror into a family-friendly science fiction show. The Borg they're techno-zombies. And that they are very much about body. In fact, so much so that they did hire H.R. Giger to try and, I think they try and redesign them for the movie or something. But the Borg are very much horror and body horror.
I didn't know Giger was involved.
Yeah, I don't know if they accepted his designs, but he did do some concept art at least for the Borg, and like in the same way as he did some for the Batmobile in the Batman films. It's a weird sort of starfish thing. It's very intriguing as the car design, but utterly impractical.
Well, the Borg is definitely like the type of body horror I do like. It's more that fantastical escapism.
And again, it's playing on those, something will infect you, and it will not just cause your body to rebel against itself, but do it to a point where it mentally infects you. And you will then become the vampire. It's very much a play on vampirism.
Yeah,
they turn people, but it's using the techno-zombie aesthetic for it.
Yeah,
all this big hive mind, which of course plays into the thing as well. This hive mind community where they're all mentally interlinked. That is not body horror, but that happens to be part of what makes the Borg so ominous.
Yeah, definitely. So what do you think, Eric? Do you think we've tied a nice bow on the topic of body horror?
I think so. Because it's fleshy and messy and our hands are dirty. No, it's a fascinating subject.
Yeah,
you can never get a grips on it. all we can do is say body horror is one of those things where, as per its nature, it's going to continue to reshape itself, evolve, make new fusions of things. We are going to 5-10 years from now, we are going to see new entries into the genre in the same way that vampire media has done, and it's going to be in books, games, comics, cartoons, everything. And we're going to say, oh, that's a landmark. That is the thing, or whatever. Right now, we're apparently getting another remake of The Fly, where Zendaya, I think pronounce her name, she's going to be, I don't know if it's Seth Brundle or a different character, or maybe the romantic, but she's going to be one of the leads. Are they going to go body horror in that, or are they going to be more of they're not going to focus on the mutational aspect? If they don't, I think that's squandering. It's going to waste an opportunity. I think body horror is something where I don't think we've yet seen it peak. It's not yet like Lovecraft. No one's done the perfect Lovecraftian adaptation. Body horror, we've had a taste of body horror, no pun intended, but we've not yet seen it at full strength. I think as we go on, we are gonna see more and more. I think it's one of those things where, in order to do it well, it's got to live up to that proverb, the old saying of not less is more, but everything in moderation.
Yeah. No.
You've got to get that key of don't shove it at the viewer's face. Don't saturate everything like zombies. Everything is zombies now, and you go, do something different with it, please.
Yeah.
Used wisely it's not something which is often something which aimed to be body horror. It's not something we often see, and it's not something we often see done well. No. But when it is, it's something that stays with you. And I am very interested to see where it goes from now. In a month's time, I bet you, a month from when this is released, something's going to get released and we'll go, oh, if we'd have waited, we could have talked about that. But yeah,
we'll see.
Fascinating. The DNA is, it will be ever changing into the future in this.
All right. On that note, we're going to depart. Eric, you need to go watch Tusk, and I will go watch Human Centipede.
It's not a family-friendly affair. It is, but it's not, blood everywhere. The sequel is not as good. But all right,
you'll have to keep working on me on that one, but maybe someday. So. All right, I guess that's a wrap. So, Eric,
and we hope you've enjoyed listening to us.
Yes. Hopefully, everyone's enjoyed this conversation, and if they have, maybe we'll continue this format. All right. On that note, let's say goodbye, Eric. Bye, everybody.
Bye, kids.